Thank you all for coming. I'm really glad that so many of you came, and a significant percentage of this room is my family. So thank you for being here. In fact, I had actually anticipated a smaller crowd, given the other competing eminent lecture in this venue today. And so I had prepared remarks that are perhaps less finished than they should be for an audience of this size. So I hope that you will bear with me as I present some work to you which is new and provisional and not in the state of polish that it should be. So please forgive me for that. So without too much further ado, let me begin by offering my deepest thanks to the members of the Sayyid Amir Hassan Abidi Memorial Society for inviting me to speak today. It really is truly a great honor for me to be here in Delhi, in the city that I work on, in the city that I'm from, to be able to speak to you today. Professor Abidi, his own path-breaking work in the study of Indo-Persian literature, his enormous body of work, in fact, has continued to fuel scholarship, including my own today. So I'm very grateful also for the tradition of the study of pre-modern South Asia and Indo-Persian literature and history, which has been kept alive by the efforts of so many people in this room. Okay. So let me begin now. As we know, it has become common to hear today of a so-called Muslim period in Indian history, a period that is often described as one of slavery, ghulami. No serious historian, of course, would speak of it in these terms. And I too would be tempted to dismiss it outright, but for the fact that in pre-colonial India, one encounters in one's sources Hindu officials routinely and proudly declaring themselves as the slaves, the ghulams, of their Muslim masters, ghulams, bandas, khanazads. And this raises a question for me, and the question is, what is the meaning of these kinds of statements? What did servitude across religious boundaries in pre-modern South Asia mean? And my fundamental claim today will be a very banal and very simple claim. And the claim will be fundamentally that slavery, particularly what is sometimes regarded or thought of as Islamic slavery or Islamic forms of substitute, were both a key mode for the functioning of the Mughal Empire and the Mughal state, and that they were far more productive for their non-Muslim adherents than is commonly supposed. Okay. So, in keeping with the spirit and the themes of the work of Professor Abidi, I'm going to explore these questions by focusing on the Mughal literateur, poet, and courtier Anand Ram, whose poetic pen name was Mukhlis. Mukhlis is someone who describes his life in his diary entitled The Badai-e-Wakai, or The Fresh Events, which is a set of texts that he wrote over the 1730s and the 1740s. So let me tell you a little bit about Anandram Mukhlis's life. In 1699, the year in which Anandram, hereafter Mukhlis, was born, the Mughal Empire stretched across the vast expanse of the Indian subcontinent. It's approximately 100 million souls ruled by a great nobility, an enormous army, and a sprawling bureaucracy. All were held together by an imperial court, atop which rested the solitary figure of the aged emperor Aurangzeb. Aurangzeb died in 1707, when the 8-year-old Mukhlis was still memorizing the classic works of Persian literature. And the vicious fratricidal war that broke out among his sons plunged the realm into chaos. By the time Mukhlis was a youth of 20, a succession of emperors had risen to the peacock throne in Delhi and had been violently thrown from it by a newly assertive nobility. While the youthful Mukhlis sampled the pleasures of an imperial capital and a court that seemed to glitter on as usual, the empire was progressively hollowed out by ambitious aristocrats who began to carve principalities out of provinces. In Middle Age, when Mughals had attained great wealth and success at court, disaster struck unforeseen. In 1739, the Persian ruler Nadir Shah swept almost unopposed into the Mughal heartland and occupied Delhi after the barest resistance. Mughals witnessed Nadir Shah's frightful massacre of Delhi's resistant citizenry and the surging power of the Sikh, Afghan, and Maratha war bands, which began to claw away the former territories of the empire. A prolific and famed writer, Mughals was a key figure in the literary scene of the Mughal capital of the 18th century. We are fortunate in possessing the widest and most diverse oeuvre of any Mughal intellectual from the 16th to the 18th centuries in the surviving writings of Anandram Mukhlis, who for this reason is a figure well known to scholars of the Mughal Empire. My own remarks today are thus enabled by a great body of modern scholarship on Mukhlis, and I would like to acknowledge in particular the work of Muzaffar Alam and Sanjay Subramaniam, as well as Professor Chandrasekhar Bhatnagar, whose efforts in editing and publishing the works of Mukhlis and others has really been absolutely foundational for future generations of scholarship, including my own. So, I would like to begin with the screen is blank for some reason. So I would like to begin with an arzi, a petition that Mukhlis sent to the Wazir of the Mughal Empire in the year 1737. This document was received by the Wazir, who signed it with what Mukhlis calls a European pen, which is perhaps just a lead pencil, a kalam-e-firangi, and there's an interesting history of lead pencils to be told, but this is not the time for that. Mukhlis lovingly preserved many instances of such routine correspondence signed by the Wazir in his commonplace book, or Bayaz, which is today held at the British Library, along with autographs of famous contemporary poets and calligraphic masterpieces in his collection. So we will return to the substance of this petition later in this lecture, but here I want to note merely that in the lower left corner of the page, Mukhlis signs by saying Arzi-e-Khanazad, right? How should we understand the term Arzi-e-Khanazad or Khanazad? What relationship does it imply to the Wazir? We know that the term Khanazad means houseborn slave. Yet, other than the emphasis accorded to them by the late J.F. Richards, it seems we have been insufficiently attentive to the significance of such terms. One might dismiss these kinds of statements by several means. We might, for one, say that these were just literary convention, or that the relationship implied here was not really of slavery in the ways that we recognize or understand slavery to be. I will offer brief arguments against both of these positions before exploring the question of servitude across religious boundaries under Mughal rule by taking a closer look at the relationship of Mukhlis with the Wazir. So, about half a century ago, Jonathan Spence, the distinguished historian of China, made the point in his first of many books that ethnicized servitude, that is, relationships of servantship between Manchu rulers and Han subjects, were ones in which ethnic differences were not dissolved, but scrupulously maintained, and that such differences were integral to the working of the Qing state. Spence's insight, I think, equally applicable to the study of early modern South Asia. In the Mughal case, historians have long known that the administrative establishments of the Mughal Empire, the bureaucrats who actually ran the empire from day to day, were frequently Hindu. This has been taken as evidence of the indigenization, in quotes, of the conquest state, its inevitable coming to rely upon local or native intermediaries, which somewhat paradoxically reinforces the sense of Muslims as outsider conquerors. I would submit that the employment of Hindus in the key financial and other offices of the empire was not an accident, and nor were they selected on the basis of merit. That is, Brahmins and Khatris and Kayasts did not simply happen to be good at reading, writing, and arithmetic. Rather, the Hindu administrative elite, of which men like Mukhlis were a part, were required to be demarcated from the ruling elite, Muslim or Hindu, precisely so that kinship relationships could not develop, so that there were formal separations and hierarchies of power which could not be encroached or overturned. In this sense, religious difference between rulers and their administrative staff was not an obstruction to be overcome, but a firewall which had to be upheld to preserve the Mughal state as a functional object. One might go further to speculate that sectarian difference thus performed a caste-like function in early modern South Asia. Now, to the question of servitude, a subject on which a rich vein of recent scholarship by Pankaj Jha, Nitin Sinha, Nitin Verma, the late Sunil Kumar, and others has illustrated the centrality of these institutions in South Asian life, particularly in the pre-modern period. Servitude, the long-term transgenerational ties of service and dependence, colored with emotions of love and care, and flavored with the values of loyalty, was the key institution which bound administrative to political elites and so cohered the Mughal establishment. As a set of ideals, values, behaviors, deportments, and practices, servitude derived its shape from the patterning forces of gender, caste, and religious identity. Let me say a few words also about questions of style and meaning as we approach the question of servitude across confessional boundaries as they appear in the writings of Anandram Mukhlis. A major question which arises is that of the interpretation of style and meaning in Indo-Persian prose, particularly that of the 18th century. Such prose, which is frequently described as florid on account of its embrace of extended metaphor, allegory, and rhetorical flourishes, has long been looked on with disfavor by historians and scholars of literature, both Indian and Persian or Iranian. By contrast, the scholarship of Shamsur Rahman Farooqi, Paul Lozensky, Rajiv Kinra, and others has established that even highly stylized forms of writing have the potential to be profoundly meaningful, and that will be my position today. This is quite an important question when we consider the fact that ideas of servitude, bandagi for instance, form a very important part of Mukhlis's intellectual repertoire. Mukhlis describes himself routinely in his writings as a banda, a khanazad, or a pir ghulam, an aged servant of the Wazir Itimad-ud-Dawla. So we could dismiss such references as the standard and meaningless forms of self-deprecation that are common to this culture. But to do so, I think, would miss the centrality of servitude and indeed slavery as an institution in the early modern South Asian world, again, to which a rich vein of scholarship has pointed in the last 2 decades. And I'm thinking of the volume of Indrani Chatterjee, Richard Eaton, and others. Vast numbers of servants waited on Mukhlis himself, from named personal servants, khidmat garan, who appear as vocal and agentive in his writings, to the shadowy horde of unnamed workers who appear only as disciples, shagird peshagan. This was also a world of forced labor and actual slavery in which people were bought and sold. Indeed, Delhi in the 18th century appears to have witnessed a series of kidnapping raids in which vulnerable children were stolen, castrated, and trafficked as eunuchs. This was also a world in which people imagined the relationships between themselves and the Almighty as that of slavery and submission. And so I think we cannot simply dismiss also the embrace of metaphors of slavery in the rituals of courtly life as the European fantasies of an Oriental despotism. But what exactly was Islamic about this language? This is a rather large question, which in turn revolves around what we think Islam itself is. And this is a subject which we shall approach repeatedly but orthogonally over the course of our discussion today. At this stage, however, I want to suggest that the textual domination of Islam, that is, the ruling presence of signs and symbols of the Islamic faith in the practices and representations of the written word, was a bedrock of literary existence for someone like Anandram Mukhlis. So a good place to make this point is by turning to the beginning of Mukhlis's Badai-e-Wakai, or fresh events. It was utterly unremarked as an elementary scribal practice, but we should pause for a moment to consider the significance of what is dismissed as a meaningless stylistic convention. Okay? Without belaboring this point, it seems to me that such an incipit, or the beginning of a text, marks the text as both circulating within a sphere of other texts that are unequivocally, or what you might call standardly, Islamic, but it also marks the author staking a claim of participation and belonging in this vast textual sphere without any personal denominational affiliation to Islam. Similarly, we might note Mukhlis's scrupulous adherence to the Islamic calendar in his careful recordings in his fresh events. Now again, we might see this as a simple-minded adherence to the practices of the bureaucracy. But we should consider what it might mean to orient life by the Islamic calendar. As the US historian David Henkin has recently argued, and I'm quoting now, perceptions of weekly rhythms reflect and conceal tiny details of ordinary experience that make up complex social interactions, webs of interdependence, and layers of history which link the observable world to deep sensations of the passing of time itself. Henkin's observations are equally applicable here. To conduct life and to plan for the future according to the Islamic calendar is, in this quite literal sense, to live in Islam. And we will see an example of this from Mukhlis's own life in the near future. So I've made the case that we should take the language and the institutions of servitude, and Islamic servitude in particular, seriously for this period. Now I'm going to take a look at the relation of Mukhlis to his master, the Wazir. Okay. So the relationships of masters and servants rested on reciprocal obligations that were, however, not bilaterally enforceable. Mukhlis describes how his grandfather, Rao Gajpat Rai, had been the vakil of a certain Mirza Muhammad Afzal in the reign of Aurangzeb. This Mirza Muhammad Afzal soon rose to prominence thanks to the exertions of Rao Gajpat Rai, who even secured the Mirza's son's marriage to a daughter of Maryam Begum. Since this Maryam Begum was a foster sister of Alia Begum, who was in the harem of the Prince Azim Shan, this son was quickly elevated to the title of Sarbuland Khan, all because of Rao Gajpat Rai and his son Raja Hridayram. Yet, when Raja Hridayram died while in the service of Sarbuland Khan, Hridayram's son, our author, Anand Ram, did not receive a position from Sarbuland Khan. In fact, Sarbuland Khan even refused to pay Anand Ram the 80,000 rupees due to him in arrears for his father's work. The point of this old story, writes Anand Ram, is that the Lord closed the eyes of honor to these rights of service, hukuk-e-khidmat, as he calls it. Elsewhere, he calls them a nawab-e-haq nashinas, right? So what this story demonstrates is that elite servitude was built around an idea of reciprocity in rights. This idea had a long and distinct genealogy in South Asia, recently demonstrated in a very good essay by Hassan Siddiqui, to which I draw your attention. But there were no guarantees to such reciprocity. Perhaps as elsewhere in the early modern world, contracts between traders might be legally enforceable, but if a lord chose to ignore the rights of servitude, there could be no consequences. By the late 1730s, however, Mukhlis was the agent of even more influential noblemen than Sarbuland Khan. For one, he was the agent at court of the powerful governor of Punjab, Azud-Daula, Zakaria Khan. For another, he was the agent of Zakaria Khan's maternal cousin, the Mughal Wazir, the Prime Minister, Kamaruddin Khan, Itimad-ud-Daula. Here's a portrait of Kamaruddin Khan. Now, both Kamaruddin Khan and his cousin claimed descent from Khwaja Ahrar, the founder of the Ahrari Naqshbandi way, who was associated with the Turkic Turani Mughal community. In this way, Mughal was essentially the court representative of what has been described as the Turani faction at the Mughal court. Mukhlis himself saw the Wazir as his primary, or at any rate immediate master, but he also saw himself as associated with what has been regarded as the sword arm of the Mughal state. So he goes on to describe the Wazir, for instance, as engaged in, and I'm quoting, advancing the works of rulership, Kishwar Kashai, that was something like a hereditary obligation appointed by imperial law, Kanuni, to this great family, Vala Dudman. The primary term that Mukhlis uses to describe his relationship with the wazir is that of bondage or bandagi. If bondage was not slavery, it nevertheless represented involuntariness and unfreedom. So when Mukhlis describes reluctantly accompanying the wazir's army on a campaign against the Marathas, he says, "Waba iktizai alam bandagi ha कि दर्जाए अव्वलीनश बकाम गैरी जिंदगानी नमूदनस्त दिले फरागत तलब बतहैया इस्तिकबाल परदाख्त." And I'll translate. And according to the exigencies of the world of service, the first principle of which is to expend one's life in extraneous matters, I set my repose-seeking heart in acceptance of the fact that I had to go on this campaign. The other aspect of servitude was that of ritualized submission. Thus, when not having accompanied the wazir after all, Mukhlis greets him on his return to Delhi. He does so at Parso, a town called Parso near Badkal Lake, which was a full day's march from the city. He says that he was, and I'm quoting, permitted to kiss the feet on which he would sacrifice 1,000 lives, and he was exalted by the shadow of the hand of kindness over the head of my faithfulness. Now, I would read this again, not only metaphorically, but also perhaps as referring specifically to the practice of kadambosi, kissing the feet of the master, which is not restricted only to the dargah. Ritualized submission was reciprocated by condescension. While I've just suggested that the entire purpose of having Hindu administrators was to prevent the development of kinship relations, servitude nonetheless produced kin-like relations. This is most spectacularly evident at life cycle events such as births, deaths, and weddings. Consider the occasion of the marriage of one of Mukhlis's sons to be conducted at Batala. The wazir, we are told, begins by gifting 1,000 rupees on the occasion. He then orders the zamindars along the route, many of whom served in the wazir's jagir, to assist the procession in every way. As the wedding party, from which Mukhlis was himself absent, proceeded up the roads to Batala, they received a summons from the governor of Punjab. Mukhlis's sons were thus obliged to make a considerable detour, one from his own wedding, from their planned journey. Again, Mukhlis's sons kissed the governor's feet, and by way of perfect banda nawazi, the governor clasped the sons' heads to his breast. Az-Zudawla went so far as to say, "I count you amongst my innermost circle of the truly faithful. God knows that I love you as much as the exalted Mirzas." As much as the exalted Mirzas, of course, but without the possibility of intermarriage. So at the end of the entertainment, the governor assigned a party of 20 chowkis of singing courtesans who were given a per diem of rupees 200. So this is a really considerable, serious expenditure. And it shows you the sense of the reciprocality of the obligations of rulers towards their servants in the elite realm. As a bondservant not just of the nobleman named Kamaruddin Khan, but the vizier of the realm, Mukhlis served not only an individual, but the empire itself. As an imperialist, he affiliated very closely with the ideological principles of the empire. These, it should be emphasized, were not religiously neutral or secular principles. Again, they hinged on the formal separation of denominational communities, separations that were invoked in the operation of imperial power. Some 3 decades ago, in an important essay, Zahiruddin Malik argued that, and I'm going to quote, "the terms Hindus and Muslims were rarely used and then only to indicate the bulk of the population. The term Mughal did not represent any particular religious community or caste, but was a heterogeneous class comprising divergent racial and religious groups who were directly associated with the imperial administrative apparatus. So Savai Jai Singh, a Rajput, was as much a Mughal in outlook and moorings as Khan-e-Doran, an Indian Muslim." Let me now offer some evidence countervailing this attractive claim. So consider the campaign led by the Wazir in 1737, which resulted in a minor defeat for a major rebel named Bhagwant, a zamindar named Bhagwant. Mukhlis tells us that the core of the imperial army that was summoned was described by Mukhlis as, and the term he uses is the Khawaneen-e-Mughaliya, the Mughal Khans, and they're named Karra Khan Bahadur, Shamsher Jang, Mehdi Khan Bahadur, Talib Jang, Azimullah Khan, Mujahid Jang, Ghaziuddin Khan, Firoz Jang. To this force, Mukhlis tells us that the following were required to append themselves without prevarication or delay. Raja Indar Singh, Zamindar of Bhadawar. Durjan Singh, the Marzban of Kota. Rao Ramchandar, the Pisar, or son of Dalpat Bundela, the Zamindar of Datia. What I find most interesting about this list is the kind of unmistakable contempt of these terms. Rajas dismissed as lowly zamindars, as marzbans or frontier lords. Rao Ramchandar is not the Farzande Arjumand, but merely the Pisar or Ladka of Dalpat Bundela, the Zamindar of Datia. Elsewhere, Jagat Singh, the Maharana of Udaipur, would have been astonished to hear his principality dismissed as a mere zamindari, one granted by the imperial court that came along with the condescending title Maharana Kamran. Now, such contempt was not reserved for Hindus alone. On the way to crush Bhagwant, the army stops by Shergarh, a hellish place built by some minor figure named Sher Shah Afghan, which was in the grip of banditry and disciplined by way of the cannon. Later we learn that Bhagwant's fort was taken by the, and I'm quoting, Bahaduran-i-Lashkar-e-Islam, who donning shields that bloomed like a crop of scarlet greatcoats under the rain of gunshot, uttered the cry of Ya Fattah as they charged. This is important because it demonstrates for us that Mukhlis saw nothing incompatible between a victory couched in unambiguously Islamic terms, which was also a victory in which he could rejoice as a Hindu. Such affiliation was made possible by the institution of bond servitude or bandagi. This is precisely what is expressed in the panegyric that Mukhlis composed for his master on Bhagwant's defeat. I offer a rough and ready translation of the slightly different version of this text, which is recorded by Mukhlis in his Fresh Events. And I'm not going to read this whole mass of text on the screen, but I do want to make a couple of points. If you just look at the highlighted bits. One, the constant repetition of these ideas of bond service. And two, the celebration of a victory that is the gift of an unnamed God who is claimed by prayer and named with recognizably Islamic epithets. Okay. In 1737, as the rumblings of an Iranian campaign approaching the borders of India began to reach Delhi, a vast Maratha army was discovered to have penetrated the Mughal heartland of Hindustan, reaching so close as Agra. Mukhlis, who refers to the Marathas as the Ishkiyai Jahannum Mawa Dakhani, the hell-dwelling criminals of the Deccan, offers a very clear-eyed account of their rise to power. He says, since Girdhar Bahadur, the governor of Malwa, had been killed in the battle with the Deccani criminals, the Ishkiyai Dakhani, and a governor who might bring that province out of disorder had not been appointed from the caliphal forecourt, every year the armies of the Deccan came to molest Hindustan, and they raided this land, every fistful of earth of which is like the dregs of the glass which tug at the heart. These days, Baji Rao, the power behind the throne of Raja Sahu, the governor of the Deccan, led 50,000 lancers from his place to the borders of the province of Akbarabad, and the familiar spectacle of raid and pillage, which you might say has been the custom of Hindustan for some time now, was refreshed again. On the 22nd of March, 1737, a large Mughal army led by the Wazir Kamaruddin Khan set forth from Delhi to confront Baji Rao. First, the Wazir stopped to pay his respects to the Chishti tombs outside Delhi to seek blessings for victory. Then, as the army moved down the Jamuna towards Agra, Bajirao wheeled past them, leaving Agra on his right, and approached Delhi itself. Anand Ram, who had joined the Wazir on this campaign, treated this as the confused flight of a fox who had spotted a lion, or a dog with singed paws running helter-skelter, rather than the audacious threat to the undefended capital city that it was. On the 4th of April, the Mughal army raced back towards Delhi, marching 30 crores or 45 miles, reaching the village of Paseru near Sohna at dusk. The foragers who went out looking for water for the parched men and animals were first beset by Mewatis. But Baji Rao had by this time moved on towards Delhi, for which Mukhlis could only say, Hufiz Allah Ta'ala anna la fati, may God protect it from calamities. 5 days later, on the 9th of April, writes Mukhlis, like an unexpected calamity, Baji Rao reached the hill of Kalka, which is a pilgrimage ground of the Hindus, and which he surrounded with blackness, like his own fate. Parenthetically, we note here the prejudice against dark complexion, which is stereotypically invoked against Deccans by Mughals. The Marathas did not show any regard for their co-religionists, raided them, and took them prisoner. Some of the people fled towards the city saying, Pehelwan zinda khushast, namely, a strong man is happiest alive. Mukhlis felt offended that even now his friends in Delhi refused to take the threat seriously, apparently regarding these travails as an amusing spectacle. The city's garrison did not dare to sally forth, but was able to keep the Marathas at a distance by volleys of gunfire and rockets. Two noblemen who did charge forth, Mir Hasan Khan and Shiv Singh Hazari, were cut down by the Marathas. Hasan Khan fell wounded to the ground, says Mukhlis, and poor Shiv Singh's white beard was dyed with the henna of blood, and he was carried to the house of the Rahim and the Karim. Mukhlis was delighted when the imperial armies finally combined to expel Baji Rao, whom he calls that infidel of upside-down fortune, Vazoon Bakhtan Kafir. The battle, which took place near Sarai Ali Vardi Khan in Gurgaon, was by no means foreordained. Mukhlis was part of the army and witnessed the clash, which began at dusk and continued into the night. The Mughal army, which had left its main park of artillery behind, launched a classical attack, but was completely encircled by a seething horde of Marathas who peppered them with a rain of arrows. The Mughals pulled up their horses and resorted to short arms, kota yarak, charging until the Marathas disengaged and withdrew. Mukhlis describes the battle as a great victory, but from his account it is very clear that this was a close-run thing. Notable is Mukhlis's exaltation of and celebration in the bloodshed of the day. As the Mughals charged the Marathas, says Mukhlis, it was as if light fell upon dark, and the noise of Allahu Akbar of the braves, the Yalan, reached the heavens. Their garments were rent by wounds of the braided sword, and their coats of mail were colored like cheat kalamkari cloth. Their shields were filled to the brim with the wine of blood, and the girdle of wounds lay so beautifully on the backs of these youths, and the blood which dripped down the skirts of the Turks rent their edges red and vermilion, giving proof of their masculine honor. The dagger, like a warm-blooded friend, was held firm in the Turks' sides, and spear by spear, these cypress-statured ones romanced their foes. Mukhlis now goes on to eulogize their weapons. In sprinkling blood, the halberds were like the narcissus whose leaves are painted red by children. Swords were adorned in color from head to foot, like a branch of flowers in the full bloom of spring. Guns, which for so long had stopped up their loathing, vented now in full blast. Fire-sprinkling rockets bearing a seal on the Book of Doom were sent by comrades from Delhi for the people of the Deccan. And shots from the musket, booming like perdition, were a present of love from the people of Jahanabad for that community lost from its homeland. There's much to say about this language, which produces a kind of dark or bloody inversion of the sarapa, namely the literary form eulogizing the beloved in a head-to-toe description, which is classical in Persian. We could also discuss the eroticization of violence, the joyful reveling in blood, which beautifies the Turkic beloved. And parenthetically, I offer a nice verse of Mukhlis which plays with some of these ideas, comes from his divan. तुर्की के मनम जख्मी मुशगाने हो बर गर्दन चश्मे उवस्त खून आहू दिल सजदा अब्रुअश पजाम यारद शमशेर चुनन के मी परस्तद हिंदू. Right? The Turk by whose eyelashes I'm pierced wears in his eyes the blood of the deer. It is right for the heart to bow before his brow, just as the Hindu worships the sword. So eyebrows are like swords, eyelashes are like spears. But what I find most noteworthy about the sarapa, this bloody sarapa that Mukhlis offers, is the lack of distance, ironic or otherwise, between the observing bureaucrat and the blood-drenched warrior. At a moment when an army from across the Narmada, the southern frontier of Hindustan, and Mukhlis is very clear, he knows that Hindustan ends at the Narmada, had invaded so deep into the empire as to threaten the safety of Mukhlis's home, his family, his namus, and as they attempted to kill him and his friends, Mukhlis expresses a perfect identification with the Turkish soldier. The conclusion towards which I'm inescapably led is that at such a moment for Mukhlis, the Turk did not refer to a figure of the other, but of the self. And that when he is speaking of the Yalano Tarkan who charge against the Deccanese, he is speaking of himself. On this battlefield, for Mukhlis, we are all the Turks. Okay, so to conclude, let me now turn very briefly to a second master to whom Mukhlis also serves as a bondservant. This was the Sheikh Qutbuddin Bakhtiyar Kaki. And here the evidence is rather more tenuous, but we can still see that bonds which tied Mukhlis to Bakhtiyar Kaki were no less powerful than those which tied him to the Wazir and the empire. Bakhtiyar Kaki is today subordinated in importance to his spiritual descendant, Sheikh Nizamuddin Aulia, but in the Mughal period, this axis of axis, Qutbul Aqtab, as he was styled, had precedence over all others. The environs of Bakhtiyar Kaki's grave were also a very scenic spot for an excursion for those feeling a bit cooped up in Shahjahanabad's Sheherpana walls. So when Mukhlis describes his own trip with his family in the last days of August 1738, I assume that this was essentially a pleasure trip. Indeed, the author devotes a great deal of time, as usual, to telling us about the food he ate late at night on arriving there, the gorgeous spectacle of the kaddu and the tori flowers in full bloom, and so forth. Right? This was also the period of Shrad. And so Mukhlis parenthetically mentions conducting the rites of Shrad Duj at his morning bath, though this inauspicious moment did not dampen the partying, which followed in Mukhlis's private garden nearby, where mango trees and rose bushes were in full bloom. On the 29th of August, 1738, Mukhlis tells us he proceeded to the Roza-e Munawwara Muttahira, the illuminated grave of Bakhtiyar Kaki, and as he says, quote, placed the brow of observance on the ground of adab and adorned the eyes of the heart with the jewel dust of that pure earth. He also composed a number of verses to commemorate that occasion, which I will not repeat here. So at first I could not understand why Mukhlis took this pleasure excursion at this time. Mukhlis himself does not offer us any reason in his account. It only became clear to me a little later when I realized the trip was related to Mukhlis's much-awaited grandson, Musahib Singh. When Musahib Singh was born, Mukhlis took an omen, a fal, by opening his copy of the Diwan-e-Hafiz. The omen was extremely positive, and Mukhlis left a Madan Ban flower, which he regarded as the most fragrant flower of India, on the page that had fallen open by way of commemorating this occasion. But then shortly after his birth, Musahib Singh had been afflicted with a hararat-e-jigar, a sort of heat in the liver or heart, which only worsened with time. Delhi's best doctors were summoned, including the personal physician of the king and the wazir, and no expenses were spared in procuring exotic medicines from abroad. Musahib Singh's condition did not improve. In desperation, Mukhlis retreated to the Khanka of Nawab Ghayasullah Khan in the dead of winter for 18 days. This is near Qutbuddin's grave, and renounced certain transgressive behaviors that he sadly does not mention. Then little Musahib began to get better. Mukhlis's trip to Bakhtiyar's grave was then to the same Khanqa precisely a year, an Islamic year later, on this anniversary of Musahib Singh's sickness. And on this occasion, Mukhlis's entire family came with him, assisted by some 300 servants. This was, in effect, a Thanksgiving trip for the healing of a grandchild, which presumably also came with a promise of perpetual fidelity. A second occasion on which Mukhlis came to Bakhtiyar Kaki's grave was just a few years later, on the 24th of July, 1743. On this occasion, a 35-year-old woman married to a Khatri named Bhagwan Narayan in Mukhlis's neighborhood of Vakilpura had decided to become a sati. Because Bhagwan Narayan was connected to the imperial nobility, Mukhlis tells us, a nobleman tried to change her mind by promising her money and estates and villages. But she did not accept any of these blandishments and insisted on joining her husband's corpse on its pyre. A great crowd assembled to observe the spectacle, including a large number of the city's nobility, who appeared in plain clothes to observe the widow on horseback as she went towards the cremation ground. Mukhlis recognized this act as an ultimate expression of loyalty, wafa, and feminine propriety, sharm or haya. Yet this great lover of spectacles and marvels did not find this an event worth attending. Rather, he says, and he has a poem, Why sukht zan zinda fughan ha kardem, dashto darra zigiriya darya kardem, dunyast ajab murakkai rangini, tasveer sati neez tamasha kardem. Alas, a woman burnt alive, and we all grieved. We turned step and door to an ocean with our tears. The world is a strange album of diverse colors indeed, and now we've also gaped at the spectacle of the sati. Having spent the day in burning horror where Chateau sows, and Mukhlis finally found relief by turning his, quote, indigent face towards the exalted court of His Highness the Khwaja, the axis of the truth and the faith, may God sanctify his grave, and passed some days in the color of the tulip's bud, with a rare constriction of the heart and burning of the liver. Berange guncha lalav, but tarfa dil giraftagi wa jigar suktagi. Okay, so a very brief conclusion. In this lecture today, I have suggested that if the maintenance of confessional boundaries was integral to the administrative enterprise of the Mughal Empire, the relations of servitude which transcended but did not breach such boundaries were equally important in maintaining its structures. In particular, I have attempted to highlight the importance of Islam in patterning the forms of servitude that bound someone like Mukhlis to his personal master, to the vizier, to the empires of political form, and as a personal devotion to the axis of axes, Bakhtiyar Kaki. Now, we might be tempted to draw distinctions here between Islam as a political regime and Islam as a religion. But there were no such separations between sword-wielding sultans and rosary-fondling Sufis, to borrow a phrase, and saber-rattling Ghazis for our author. After all, the Lashkar of Islam, which departed Delhi to combat the Kafir Marathas, stopped to sleek blessings for victory at the grave of the very same Bakhtiyar Kaki, to whom Mukhlis also periodically retreated. What this suggests is that the idea of submission to Islam, expressed in our historical chronicles by the term Mutiul Islam, implied something far more productive and participatory than passive obedience. And in this sense, Mukhlis, I think, serves as a paradigmatic example of one of the many, many Hindus who proudly saw themselves as lovers of Turks and the houseborn slaves of their Muslim masters. Thank you.